Ladies and gentlemen, my name is TotalBiscuit. Let's talk about early access. I gotta admit that this is a video that was inspired by the recent Jimquisition, which you should very much watch. I put the link in the description below this video. For those of you who don't know, it's a rather wonderful rant show hosted by Jim Sterling. He plays a character, for those of you wondering, and he somewhat exaggerates from time to time, but he has a very good message to bring along. He's something of the British shock jock of the gaming industry. He's very good at what he does. And I had been wanting to talk about early access for quite some time, but this seems like a pretty good time to do it, considering that a number of different platforms are starting to put out opinions on this particular program. And it is about time that it was discussed, because what you're basically talking about here is Valve's wholesale endorsement of selling unfinished games on its platform. No, I'm not exaggerating. That's what early access is. What else could it possibly be? So I want to talk about a number of things today. I want to talk about the actual principle behind that. I want to talk about early access versus pre-orders. I want to also talk about the kind of coverage that early access should actually receive. And finally, I want to talk about what I think Valve should do to improve the early access program from a consumer standpoint. So, the principle of selling incomplete products. A long time ago, I think that you could probably have just gone with the idea of caveat emptor, let the buyer beware, when it comes to buying incomplete games. You chose to buy an incomplete game. Ergo, everything that you receive, or more to the point, don't receive, is entirely on you, because you bought an incomplete game. Now, to some degree, that's correct. However, early access is now becoming so prevalent and is becoming so common in the games industry that I don't think something like caveat emptor really applies anymore. We're also talking about the notion of paying for what is basically an alpha or a beta product. Now, prior to this, when a game went into beta and they asked for people to come test it, it was usually free. So you'd go and you'd test the game and, okay, maybe it wasn't very good, but you didn't pay for it, so it really doesn't matter all that much. You could argue that that was the quid pro quo that was going on. You got to play the game for free, in return you provided feedback, even if that feedback only went as far as saying, this sucks, go to hell. However, that arrangement disappears once money comes into the picture. Once you have purchased the product, there is a certain level of expectation, and more to the point, there are actually laws that cover this kind of thing. If you talk about something as basic as the Sale of Goods Act in the UK, a very old act that covers a wide variety of purchases, then that act actually includes certain stipulations like the product must be fit for purpose, and if it isn't, then you are entitled to return that product for a refund to the retailer. That is something, of course, that does not work on Steam at all. And they are an American company, so they're not really necessarily covered by this particular act, but the law is rapidly scrambling to try and get up to date with the idea of infinitely reproducible digital copies, and what exactly is required in order to protect consumers from those products which are not up to scratch. And that only gets even more complicated when you throw in the idea of early access. When you sell something like Battlefield 4, you're selling it as a complete product. This thing has been released. So when it turns out that that game is incomplete, and when it turns out that that game is a buggy mess, that is something that you can take and say, this is unfair. This is unreasonable. We can criticize this company for doing just that, and we should be entitled to a refund. And funnily enough, for the most part, you can actually get that. Origin for quite some time has been far better at providing refunds than Steam, but in those kind of situations, as Jim pointed out quite accurately, we do criticize the company heavily for releasing something that was clearly unfinished. However, how can you criticize a company for releasing something unfinished when the game was marked as unfinished from the very start? That's where things start to get very complicated when it comes to early access. So that brings us on to the topic of how you actually cover early access games. There have been numerous websites that have come up with ideas for it, and some I would criticize heavily for the way that they've decided to do things. Eurogamer, I think, is the worst offender here, because they took that term review, something that I myself have enshrined and said, look, this is a very specific piece of content and should be done in a very specific way and is relied upon by consumers in order to make informed decisions, and they've decided, you know what, we're just going to slap the word alpha or beta on there, and we're going to treat it as if it were a review, even though it very clearly isn't. That's like saying, hey, we're going to review the first half of this movie, I hope that's okay. No, it certainly is not okay. That's not a review. It's not a finished product. You didn't beat the game. There is no game to beat. It's not even done yet. So what value could there possibly be in that? Oh yes, of course, search engine optimization and ranking, because the term review is one of the most popular search terms when it comes to looking for information on a game. Make no mistake, using the term review was a very calculated decision, and my cynical self says it's little more than clickbaiting. And I understand the idea of needing traffic for your website. You need eyeballs. I need eyeballs, but I don't try and mislead people into getting them in the first place, and I don't take the term review and then decide to muddy the water with it and say, oh, well, yeah, this too is a review. No, you cannot review an incomplete product. What you can do, of course, is a preview. You can do first impressions, you can do your impressions so far. There are all sorts of different kinds of pieces of content you can do on that, but it seems like an awful lot of sites like that are sort of stuck in the past when it comes to their terminology and the way that they do their coverage. However, what they're doing is somewhat important, and I think that it should be done an awful lot more. If something is put out on sale, then it should be criticized. It is open to criticism at that point. It's vitally important that critics look at these titles because they're selling a huge number of copies. DayZ has remained on the top sellers list for several weeks now. Rust is very high up there as well. In fact, if I look at the top 10 on Steam at the time of this recording, I can easily see that 4 of the games out of 10 are in early access. Disturbingly enough, at least 2 of those 4 games are very much lacking in features, including 7 Days to Die, that has been heavily criticized yet is still on sale for $34.99, which is a fairly hefty price to ask for a game that doesn't even have a working stealth system yet and is riddled with bugs. It would hardly be the only game in that particular genre to have these level of problems. DayZ has an awful lot of problems with it. Rust has an awful lot of problems with it. But you might cry they're in early access. They're allowed to have those kind of problems. Yes, but it's very dangerous for the uninformed consumer to just go on, see what looks like a cool game, and then just flat out buy it. I want to give props, actually, to DayZ for very specifically saying, do not buy this game unless you want to actively support development of it. It has serious issues. Most of these titles don't do anything of the sort. And that's why YouTube coverage and written coverage is very important, because consumers need to be informed of exactly what is going on with these titles and what state they happen to be in. Unfortunately, that presents a number of challenges. These games are consistently updated, so by the time that I put out a video on, say, something like Rust, the day after, all of the issues that I discussed may very well be patched, and this is the same with something like Eurogamer's alpha reviews. Okay, it's nice that you put out a review of Project Zomboid on the 30th of January, however, this game may very well be changed by the time anyone actually finds it, and does this coverage site intend to update? I doubt it. It's effectively impossible for coverage sites to keep an eye on all these games and actually consistently update their coverage of them. You can't do that. I'm not actually going out my way and blaming Eurogamer or any site that does this kind of coverage. It's really not their fault. They can't actually do that much to fix this problem. These games are in a constant state of flux, and the only information that you should be looking at is the most up-to-date information that you can possibly find when looking to purchase these titles. And unfortunately, that information is not found on the Steam page. I went to the Rust page, and this is what the Rust guys had to say about their early access game. We are in very early development. Some things work, some things don't. We haven't totally decided where the game's heading, so things will change. Things will change a lot. We might even make changes that you think are wrong, but we have a plan. It's in our interest to make the game awesome, so please trust us. Why? Why should we trust you? We have no reason. This doesn't tell me anything. This big blue box that Valve insists that all early access games have, which I might add is only available on the store page, it's not available on the front page where a lot of these games are listed, is more often than not filled with flat promises and vague nonsense. This information is flat out useless to me. You haven't told me anything. If I want to find out further information, then I can go to the recent updates section, which has a massive great wall of text, and some of this stuff is quite useful if you keep looking at it. The problem is, a lot of this information is only really useful in the context of someone that already owns the game. I couldn't tell you what the effects of all of these changes actually are for the most part. Why? Because I don't already own the game. It's nice to be able to read patch notes, but this doesn't help me. Doors will no longer fly away. Okay, that's really nice, Rust, but did that affect the gameplay in any way? Shelters can be placed closer together than they used to be able to. Alright, well, I don't know if that helps the game. Was that an issue? That shelters couldn't be put close together? Were they too far apart? Was there some kind of gameplay reason as to why this was bad? There's a ton of stuff in here that I really cannot explain. So, to me, these updates are not helpful. What would be helpful is information as to how complete the game actually is and major features that are missing, which unfortunately don't seem to be listed outside of occasional titles like Godus that only offers that information once you've purchased the game in the first place. If you head over to the Godus Early Access page, you will not find the level of information that you actually see in-game, which describes how finished the game actually is and what's missing. That isn't there. That's useful information, and that's something that I feel Valve should be enforcing upon anyone that wants to sell an unfinished product on their store. Because as much as Valve would like to dodge it, I believe they do have a certain degree of liability, because that's how regular retailers work. When you go for a refund, at least in the UK, you take that product back to the retailer. They have a level of liability there, and then they escalate that back to the manufacturer. That's how the system works. That's what I grew up with, so that's the level of expectation that I happen to have, and Steam and indeed most digital distributors have avoided this entirely up to this point. And I think perhaps that was okay if all they were doing was selling finished games, but they're not. They've started to sell a lot of unfinished products. As far as I'm concerned, every single early access page should have a detailed breakdown of what is currently in the game and what is not in the game. I want to hear the mission statement. And I'm not getting that. That little blue box with the paragraph of information, this is useless. I'm looking at Goddess, once again, completely and totally useless. All along the way, we've shared our passion as the worlds, the people. Shut up! This is unbelievably useless information. This is not selling the game to me, and it's not giving me the info that I need to make an informed purchase. How close to finished is this game? What key features are missing? What kind of experience can people expect if they buy in at this stage? Those are the kind of things I want to know. I want to see percentage breakdowns. Alright, 60% of the graphical assets of this game are currently done. I want to see freaking slider bars, anything, just something that allows me to visually tell at a glance just how finished this thing is. Now, some people would argue that early access is perhaps better than pre-orders, and I can certainly see why. I think that if you pre-order a video game, as I've stated many times in the past, that you are taking an unnecessary risk for no gain. You're throwing down money for something that you don't know about, and you're doing so purely on the basis of marketing material, which makes you a little bit of a sap, I'm afraid. That makes you an easy mark. You shouldn't be doing that because you can't trust these companies to provide you with accurate information prior to the game coming out. And if there are no reviews and there's no previews, first impressions, or anything like that available, you cannot make an informed decision. Now, you can make an informed decision with early access because these games don't have non-disclosure agreements or embargoes on them. So once they come out in early access, it's a free-for-all. You can find that information, but it's very difficult to find properly up-to-date information, unless you find a channel that has dedicated itself to covering that particular game, which in itself, by the way, might be a very biased channel as a direct result of that, because they're already invested in that title, then you are going to be lacking any form of information because the developers aren't required to provide it. They're not required to be transparent. They're not required even to be honest on their Steam page. We've only seen a single example of a game taken down in that respect, and that was, of course, the War Z, which was very quickly brought back up with a slightly updated description and then was renamed to Infestation Survivor Stories and is still missing a metric ton of features and all sorts of things like that. It comes down to the fact that there has to be a fairly stringent set of standards enforced across all titles, and it's not happening. Some titles give more information than others. If I actually go to the 7 Days to Die page, I can find some good info there. It'll say current features and then it says under construction. This is good info. But not all of these pages have that. In fact, most of them don't. The War Z was crucified for listing features that weren't actually in the game, but it seems like early access titles are getting away with it scot-free across the board. And who the hell knows how much of what is written on that page is really true and is actually in the game or may be coming in future or may not even arrive at all. And that gets us to the next point. What on earth is the incentive to even finish? The problem with early access is that it brings in funding for an incomplete product. And that means that you do not have to finish the game in order to actually get paid for it. The traditional model of development is you have got to finish the game, and once you've finished the game, you can sell it, and that's when you can make your money. No longer is this the case. The incentive for actually finishing the game, and by that I mean truly finishing it, making it feature complete and not suck, is that you get incredibly bad publicity once that thing comes out if it actually ends up being an incomplete product, and then reviews slam it, at least that's the hope, and people don't buy it as a direct result. Now, unfortunately, plenty of AAA developers have been getting past this lately by throwing such a large marketing budget at the title that the pre-orders are able to completely bypass this problem and just sell copies before the thing even comes out, before anyone knows whether or not it works properly. Battlefield 4 is the most recent and obvious example, with reviews praising it across the board, regardless of the fact that for the longest time it simply did not work. Very few sites actually called them out on that, and indeed I think I'm actually somewhat guilty of not calling them out on that, because my limited experience of the game didn't involve too many bugs or crashes until a couple of patches in, ironically enough. Regardless, it can be pretty hard to cover that stuff, and with launch embargoes, it's a little bit difficult. However, at least after that, they are usually pressured to fix the game. Eventually, that's gotta be done, because if they don't do it, then there are lasting consequences for them. At least that's the hope anyway. If consumers were responsible all the time, then a company like DICE would certainly not get millions of pre-orders on its next game, because it has proven that it cannot be trusted to release a current one in its proper state. Creative Assembly would not get huge amounts of pre-orders on its next game for the very same reason. However, when it comes to companies like Creative Assembly, consumers make the same mistake time and time and time again. It would hardly be the first Total War title that came out that was in an incomplete state and was a complete mess. It may very well be the most obvious example, certainly the most recent, and by far the most extreme, but Creative Assembly have a history of releasing games in incomplete states, in buggy states, and built on a foundation of broken promises. Early access games can kind of avoid that by saying, you know what, all the problems in our game are still early access related, so it's unfair to criticize the title for being broken in certain respects because it's not done yet. And that's a very odd thing to say, isn't it? That's the sort of thing that we used to be able to say across the board for actual beta releases. Now, when we got to cover those, said, look guys, it's not finished yet. Kind of say the same thing when I go and cover games at trade shows and expos. I say, look, this footage is not necessarily representative of the final product, and when that final product comes out, we can just say, right, okay, is it good, isn't it? Those were simpler times. Those were times that actually made sense, and now, as someone that does coverage of games, I'm really confused as to how best to tackle the early access situation. Does a game ever have to come out of early access? There is most likely no restriction whatsoever on Valve's end as to how long a game can stay in early access, and I think that's something that should be implemented. A game should not be able to languish in early access for 5 years, continuing to generate revenue, all the while excuses being made that, hey, it'll be fixed eventually and you can't criticize us because we're not out yet, even though we're charging money for it. That is something that Valve needs to get a handle on pronto. I certainly believe that there is an advantage to releasing your game in full, because those of us who are sitting back and saying, you know what, I'm not into this whole early access thing, are not going to be buying your title while it's still got that tag on it. So releasing it is definitely a good idea, and it also means that for the most part, more traditional outlets will then do their review on the product. And it's not like I'm coming out and saying every single dev is looking to try and rip you off with early access. That's absolutely not true. But more often than not, the road to hell is paved with good intentions, and it's not like these devs started off intending to never finish the game, but sometimes it happens. Is it therefore better for the traditional model of that game never actually coming out to apply, as opposed to early access where this game will be forever unfinished and still languish on the Steam store? That's a difficult question to answer. I'd also like to point out something of a disadvantage from the consumer end, that these early access titles can result in player burnout. And by that I mean, if you've played a game so much in its early stages, it's very easy to get bored by the time the full thing ends up coming out, and that can be a disadvantage. You might think, well, oh, it's just the player getting bored as they naturally would, and that there's no disadvantage to that, but I would argue that for multiplayer games in particular, it's quite dangerous to have a situation where players are burning out, because by the time the thing comes out, the actual community may end up being underdeveloped or starved of players. Indeed, the whole thing could end up collapsing in on itself because players get burned out during early access, and then no more players come in because they hear there's no community for it, or nobody buys the game because, again, they feel there's no more player base to actually justify it, and then the whole game just languishes, and there's plenty of examples of games on Steam that just don't have a multiplayer scene in any way, shape, or form. There's also other problems, like the idea that the few remaining players, once the game comes out, may very well be this kind of elitist core that are driving the game in one particular direction, and the new players are driving in another. There can be conflict within the player base right there. It's a bit of a can of worms when it comes to so-called community management and managing the expectations of the player base. There are definitely disadvantages to putting your game out there a little bit early. From a personal standpoint, I actually try and avoid most early access games because I'm just waiting for them to come out. A game that I backed heavily on Kickstarter was, in fact, Planetary Annihilation, and while I've had builds of that, I've just held back and said, you know what? I don't feel the need to play this right now. I'm gonna wait, and then I'm going to play it later once it's closer to release, once it's more feature complete, because by the time it comes out, I don't want to be bored of it. On perhaps a more relevant point to the majority of you, I've got to ask this. If you have limited funds, and you can only buy a certain number of games, which would be, you know, everyone on the planet, why on earth would you invest money in games that are not done yet versus buying one that is? There are tons of really great games on Steam that are finished, and you can get accurate information about. You know exactly what you're doing prior to going into them. So why would you drop money on something like Rust or 7 Days to Die? I'm not pointing those out as specifically bad titles. What I'm saying is, why would you buy something unfinished versus something that is? In the case of things like DayZ, Rust, 7 Days to Die, The Deadlinger, and all sorts of other stuff like that, it's because those games are part of a desperation genre. It's a genre that everybody wants to be a part of, but there's no finished game that really does it well, so people are scrabbling for whatever they can possibly get, and there is the potential for exploitation there, so you gotta watch out for that. Be very, very wary when you see games that say, hey, it's a crafting zombie survival sandbox thingy, because an awful lot of titles were started up after seeing that that's a popular thing, not because the developers actually wanted to make that, and that's where you get bad titles. For every DayZ, there will no doubt be plenty of inferior clones. Now, the last point that I would like to make when it comes to Steam before sort of getting to my conclusions on this whole early access thing is the fact that early access is starting to saturate Steam pretty badly. This in combination with the massive dump releases of older titles like, say, Realms of Arcania, which is currently taking up 3 spaces on the top 10 new releases of Steam, to the point where Metal Gear Rising: Revengeance, a game that only came out 3 to 4 days ago, is almost off the front page already. Early access games in particular are saturating the front page in a really bad way. The amount of stuff that is coming out on Steam is absolutely massive, and this front page new releases section does not really give you a way to filter it outside of the button that says show downloadable content, which is something that they took years to actually implement after having entire front pages completely covered in DLC, skin packs, map packs, and little monetized doodads. Thankfully, that has now been dealt with, but we're running into yet another problem in the sense that early access games, and indeed older titles like Realms of Arcania, are just making the front page very difficult to read. I feel that Steam could do a hell of a better job of, one, making it obvious that a game is actually in early access. You might say, well, they've got that little blue box. Yeah, but as far as I'm concerned, you should be able to filter out early access games entirely from that front page new releases section. The fact that you can't do that seems to almost indicate to me that Valve is endorsing and indeed promoting purchasing games that are not finished yet, which to me seems incredibly unhealthy and not something that you should be encouraging your average consumer to do. Getting involved in alphas is a really cool thing. It's great that we gain unprecedented levels of access to titles that aren't out yet. This is a really cool time for the games industry, but it has so many possibilities for exploitation, and I don't think it's something that is for everybody. I think it's something that the average game consumer should not indulge in. They should just be buying games that are finished. Leave it to the enthusiasts to go after the early access titles. At the end of the day, though, I'm sorry guys, but we can talk about who's at fault here, we can talk about Steam, we can talk about the developers themselves, we can talk about coverage sites for not giving you enough information or presenting it in an incorrect way and all that stuff, but it actually, at the end of the day, comes down to you. If you buy early access games, there's really not a lot that anyone else can actually do about that. If you continue to buy them, then of course Valve will want to sell more of them. DayZ remains in the top sellers list, a game that is in alpha at best at this point. Rust is number 2. 7 Days to Die is number 8 right now. Companies are being rewarded for releasing games that are unfinished on the early access program. And we're not talking about AAA developers here, we are talking about indies. And you might say, well, it's fine because, you know, they're indies. It's not fine. You've got to hold indies to the same ethical standards. You don't have to hold them to the same graphical standards. Of course, they're going to be smaller developers. They're not quite capable of that stuff. Maybe their games are more limited. That's fine, because that's why the games are cheaper, or they're just more limited in scope. They focus on what they're good at. That's great. A game like Nidhogg comes along and says, hey, I look like I was released on the Atari 2600. I'm hideous, but it doesn't matter because my gameplay's really good, and what I do really well, and I'm not going to cost you $60. That's okay. But if you have any doubts whatsoever about an early access title, frankly, resist the urge to buy it. There are so many other great games that are out on Steam that you can buy right now which are completely done. Yeah? They are finished, they are ready to go, and there is a wealth of accurate information out there about how good they are. That is not going to be the case with early access games. It probably never is going to be the case with early access games. The traditional style of coverage does not work when a game is vastly updated every single week. It is impossible to keep on top of that without looking at something like a fan site or a fan channel, which is in itself inherently biased. So while I might have claimed at the start of this video that caveat emptor no longer applies, right now it's actually the most important thing. In an ideal world, that wouldn't be required. Unfortunately, right now it is. Valve is not doing much on the refund side of things. They're certainly not doing much when it comes to giving you accurate information. They are not forcing developers to be transparent, and they need to. They're the ones selling this stuff. But until they do something like that, you're the guys dropping down the money. So please be careful with it. There are so many more things that you could be throwing your money at when it comes to the PC gaming scene that are actually finished and deserve it. Leave this stuff to the die-hard enthusiasts. That is what they're there for. As a casual or average game consumer, please be careful and think about where your money's going. Thank you very much for watching, folks, and I'll see you next time.